Well, welcome to Fort Gadsden. This is a small park out on the Apalachicola Forest along the Apalachicola River. It's very far from any large town. It's about an hour's drive from Tallahassee. But what happened here was a major event in U.S. and Florida history almost 200 years ago, and it was talked about in Congress quite a bit. And the Bloody Creek War and the War of 1812 left a complicated situation between the United States and Spain in Spanish Florida. In 1814, Andrew Jackson came down and defeated the Red Stick Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, and it forced the Creeks to surrender much of their land at the Treaty of Fort Jackson. Then Andrew Jackson went and captured Pensacola from the Spanish, who were allowing the British to arm the Indians against the United States. And rounding out the year, in 1815, Jackson not only defeated the Red Sticks, but he also defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, which of course made Jackson famous and later propelled him to the presidency. But affairs between the United States, Spain, and Great Britain were far from over. Creek and Seminole Indians had not finished yet, and there's a nice kiosk, and I'm showing you the displays telling the story of Fort Gadsden. The Panton-Leslie trading house was right in this area and developed trade between the Indians and the Europeans. During the War of 1812, the British used this area to organize the Creeks and Seminoles against the United States and gave freedom to any slave who left their American plantation. Well, after the War of 1812, the fort was still active with the escaped slaves, and they were preventing river traffic from coming up the river. You have people here like Colonel Duncan Clinch, and he was at Fort Scott. Well, the Americans came and blew up Negro Fort and killed almost everyone inside. They're just in one shot. That's quite an interesting story for another time. Well, the Seminoles were pretty mad because the Americans also attacked Foultown, so they attack a ship called the Scott Massacre on the Apalachicola River and kill most of the soldiers on board. Well, this brings Andrew Jackson back into the picture. He's military commander of this district of the United States, and he brings thousands of troops and allied Indians down to invade Spanish Florida. You have some of the same characters involved in this war that will later be involved in the Second Seminole War. This campaign of Jackson is known as the First Seminole War. The first thing he does is come down here in March of 1818, and one of his young lieutenants, Lieutenant James Gadsden, builds Fort Gadsden on the site of the former Negro Fort. He does such a fine job that Andrew Jackson names the fort after him. He's later in American history for the Gadsden Purchase. Well, anyway, it must have been pretty rough life here at the fort, but Jackson continues and leaves a path of destruction in Spanish Florida, hangs a couple British who are trading with Indians, and his officer here who does the execution is Edmund Gaines, who will later be famous in the Second Seminole War. One of the soldiers was Duncan McCrimmon, a Georgia soldier. He wanders away from the fort going fishing, gets captured by the Indians, and his life is saved by Millie Francis. She was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor for her act. Well, the park has a picnic pavilion, some terrifying pit toilets, no drinking water, limited parking. It's really not able to support a large group. But once you park and walk out into the field here, you'll see the earthworks of the fort. But what a lot of people don't realize is that field, this is the area of the outer fort that's surrounded by the earthworks of the outer earthworks. Once the earthworks end, the tree line is. And so the fort is right up to the river itself here. And anyway, this was a strategic point for river traffic. Right beside the fort, there's these old ship boilers and a flywheel that they recently propped up off the ground. It would be nice if they had an interpretive sign telling what they were. But the river's so close you can actually tie your boat up here to the edge of the fort. The accounts say, oh, the Negro Fort was on a high bluff. Well, it's only 10-foot elevation. It's not very high. I don't really see this as a high bluff. In fact, to the north of the fort, there's a little higher ground that's at 19 feet above sea level, and that's a little higher elevation, so maybe that's Prospect Bluff. But even the outer works of the fort, and I don't know if you can see water in the ditch, the ground is always damp. Here's the Apalachicola River, the fort looking right over the edge of the river, and there's barracks right in the middle of the fort. To get an idea of this fort, if you ever see Fort Jackson at Fort Jackson State Historic Site near Montgomery, Alabama, it was a similar fort, maybe a little larger than here. Well, you can look down the river and see where the bend is. It's far enough away that the fort at the end of the river is outside cannon shot distance. So when the Americans came up to Negro Fort, they had plenty of time to aim and load and destroy the fort. Here's a panoramic shot of the river going by. And so, anyway, the enclosed area of the fort, the United States occupied the fort with a garrison from 100 up to 278 soldiers for over 3 years, from March 1818 until Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821. We see mushrooms here. That's Creek and Seminole folklore say that's a sign you might have ghosts. Now, in the back of the outer work, behind this little evergreen, you see there's some posts in the ground, and we'll get a closer look. That is the outline of Negro Fort. It's hard to imagine 300 people packed inside that small enclosure when it explodes. One of the accounts said the settlements from Negro Fort went 50 miles up the river, so there is a lot more people that probably escaped that weren't killed in the fort, but it was a horrific death that caused here. Looking back from Negro Fort towards Fort Gadsden, a couple more panoramic views. Anyway, from the Negro Fort, there's a sign here, interpretive sign, about what happens. It really needs to be remembered more. What happened here was one of the worst tragedies in American history, and not even the Florida Park Service kept this as a park. They gave it up to the Forestry Service. So it's sad that it's kind of left alone like this. Behind Negro Fort you have a footbridge, and if you go to the footbridge you'll know it's over a canal. Well, that canal is the ditch for the outer works of the fort. Any straight body of water in Florida is not natural there. And if you go down the path beyond that, I noticed a lot of the plants growing there is gallberry, yopon holly, and sweet gum. Now to the Creek and Seminoles, gallberry is reminding of the bitterness that they've had to suffer through, and the sweet gum trees are a sign of comforting there, of sadness that's being comforted. Maybe the land's trying to heal what happened here. And further down the path you come to another small interpretive sign, and this is the burial ground where the bodies from Negro Fort were buried. I wonder if some of the soldiers who died in the fort were also buried here on the ground. There's no grave markers, there's just slight depressions in the earth where they're buried. But you have probably, black Seminoles, African Americans, U.S. soldiers, probably just buried in unmarked graves here. And this is, to me, one of the saddest things of here. I really have a sense of sadness being right here. Well, I continue down the path through some nice pine flatwood areas, listen to the woodpeckers tapping on the trees, and it dumped me right out into the roadway coming in the fort. Well, the important thing to remember is Fort Gadsden was the American foothold into Florida that started in 1818. The American flag is flied over Fort Gadsden until Florida became a territory, and Florida has been U.S. territory ever since 1818.